Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this event. It's the Bonington Gallery Formations event on lace and global material cultures. I'm Amanda Briggs-Good, and I've been working with the Lace Archive here at NTU for some time. I'm just going to start with a disclaimer and say we might go over a little bit longer than 7 o'clock, but please do remember if we do, this will be available for you on YouTube if you want to come back to it later. So to introduce what's going to happen, the first half of this event is going to be a short video of about 20 minutes, and it'll be me talking about the Lace Archive and some of the samples that we've been looking at. But the whole event hopes to share with you two projects which are focused on the NTU Lace Archive to reveal new stories to enrich our understanding of this unique fabrics relationship with the rest of the world across the 19th and 20th centuries. So this recording that I've made hopes to, in the archive, hopes to show you some context and show you some of the examples of and samples of fabrics that have been intriguing us to look and ask questions about the design and the technical approaches to how we've identified the samples that we want to consider and want to look at further. And then I will introduce you to Satiria Kogu and Alessandra Vici to talk about their analysis, their work and their initial findings on a proof of concept project, which we're in the second stages of taking forward at the moment. So if we can put the video on, please, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Professor Amanda Briggs-Good. I work here at Nottingham Trent University and I've been working with the Lace Archive for over a decade now. So to just introduce you to the archive and what we have in here, the archive is as a result of the teaching collection that developed with the art school in the teaching of lace design, and that happened over probably the collection of all the materials in here happened probably over about a century. But because it was a teaching collection and things were coming in very loosely in a very ad hoc way, we don't have very much in the way of records to actually sort of really pin that down. But what we have got is some brilliant examples of machine-made Nottingham lace, some really good records from some of the businesses that operated in the city and beyond, and just a really good archive of what is really an incredibly unique history. So I am going to talk to you about some of the things that have been really creating curiosity with myself and the team who work in here with me. Dr. Gail Baxter can't be here today, but she has helped me put together some of the things that we're going to show to you. And we've also got PhD students who work in here who are asking questions about this archive and trying to work out what it can tell us about that amazing period of lace design in this city. But to just give you a little bit of history about what Nottingham lace is, Nottingham lace really evolved from framework knitting. Framework knitting was invented in 1589 by the Reverend Lee, and that was in Nottingham, in a village on the outskirts of Nottingham called Calverton. And really that machine, that piece of technology was adapted over centuries until the beginning of the 19th century, when it was actually shifted from something that was knitted with a single thread to being something that used multiple threads and twisted. And machine-made lace is based on this twisting of threads, which emulates bobbin lace making. And in that time, you know, there were numerous innovations, but the first key innovation was in 1808, and it was by John Heathcote, and he created a net, and that netting was then sent out to embroiderers, handmade workers in Nottingham to embellish and embroider on top of. Later, in 1813 and beyond, they then developed new approaches where actually patterning could be built in to the machine-made net process. And although there was still some embroidering still going on top by hand of those machine-made net designs, that handmade industry started to decline in the city. So at the beginning of the 19th century, there's this burgeoning industry of Nottingham lace, which was creating more employment, which was creating allied industries to support that industry. So you've got dyeing and finishing, you've got engineers who needed to manufacture and look after the machinery, and there's a real growth and energy in the city. And it's sort of 1830s period, there started to be discussions about, was the design quality of the textile manufacturers of the UK, was it good enough? Did it compete with particularly sort of the French, the Italians? So what were we going to do about it in the UK? And at that time, they began discussions about art schools, and Nottingham became part of that first tranche of art schools across the UK. The others were also built in textile dominated areas like Manchester and in Yorkshire, and Nottingham was really about supporting lace and hosiery, which we specialised in. So the art school opened in 1843. It was governed and supported by the lace industry, and the first purpose-built art school, which came later in 1865, was partly funded by the lace industry, and they were part of the governing board of that early art school. So that gives you a little bit of context of what we have here. The first known things that came into the school, we know that are referred to by Falcon, who is a kind of preeminent writer about textile histories in the late 19th century, and he talks about donating some sample books to the School of Art to support teaching. And it grew and grew and grew, and it has been kept and looked after over well over 175 sort of 80 years now that the art school has been going for. So here you can see some of the sample books that we have, and we have a reputed 75,000 items in here. So we're just going to show you a little snapshot of this today, and talk about some of the things that we've been interested and excited at looking at over the years. One of the projects that I've just completed with some colleagues here at NTU has been about oral histories and about capturing stories from people who worked in the lace and textile industries in the East Midlands. I've also been really interested in pedagogy and how this amazing collection was used to teach lace design in the early 20th century and the late 19th century, and that's been a project that I've been working on for a while. But what we're going to talk to you today really is something that's come up and evolved as part of having discussions with colleagues across the university, both in science and technology and in history. So I'm going to start by showing you some samples here that we think are probably the earliest samples of machine-made net that we have in the archive, and these are from about 1790 to 1810. And they're machine-made net, and they've got some hand-embroidered patterning, so some of the raised elements that you can see on top of here have been added afterwards. It's made of silk, and it's also been starched, so when I touch it here, it's got a bit of tension to it, and the starch was really about keeping those holes really open and making sure they didn't collapse. So there are two sample books of this period, and they both contain about 300 samples, and they're thought to be the earliest machine-made lace examples that we've got in the collection. So our research has shown that the net is double press point net, and it's knitted on an adaptation of the stocking frame, and it was made before Heathcote's invention that I mentioned to you earlier, which was in 1808. So the silk, we can't produce silk in the UK, so we suspect this is either from Bengal or China, and it came to us via came to Nottingham via the East India Company. The samples are all dyed black, but as of yet, we don't know what dye materials were used. We suspect it's logwood, and this would have probably been imported from India or South America. We've been intrigued by looking at how colour has been applied to lace. We all think of lace as being white or cream, and we don't have a huge amount of coloured samples in the archive. But And so we really wanted to find out more about that. And by talking to colleagues in science and technology, we started to realise that they'd actually got some brilliant methods that were non-invasive, that could actually start to interrogate both what yarn types are being used and what kind of dye stuffs. And that opens up a whole set of questions then that is about design, and about design choices and the kinds of approaches that people, designers and the technologists working in the industry at that time could have made. But also we're really intrigued at that kind of global network. I've already sort of mentioned that we think the silk was coming from Bengal or China, that potentially logwood was coming from India or South America, that the starches that were being used, it could be wheat starch, which would obviously be UK based, but also it could be gum arabic or rice starch, which wouldn't have come from the UK. So we were really intrigued in that sort of global network that Nottingham has been involved with for, potentially decades. So I'm going to show you another example of colour and coloration in this beautiful sample book that we have here. It's got this lovely label in at the front which says Book of French Origin, Extreme Novelties about 1860 and 1870. We don't know how accurate that is, but we're sort of at this point taking it at face value and also starting to hope that we can start to test out and find out if that date is an accurate one. So on this first page you can see here there's been a kind of an addition of colour made to this lace. It's likely to have been made by hand, and in textile printing processes this approach is described as penciling. So this kind of addition of colour on top of the lace afterwards. Obviously it's incredibly labour intensive, but remember that this is at the time where, as I was mentioning earlier, there was hand embroiderers embroidering yards and yards of netted fabric. So laboured processes were possible at that period of time. So I've got a few other samples to show in here. And again, we've got an ecru lace. So we've got, it's not white. It started with a slightly different colour, and there are these beautiful greens coming through. And again, there's this tonal shading and approach you can see on this pink flower here, where they're adding depth. They're trying to add depth. I mean, the lace itself is also adding depth in terms of the way the thread has been used, but the colour's being used to emphasise that. And when we started talking to Satira and Alessandra, who will present their findings in a minute, these two samples in particular are the ones that we were really intrigued about, because it was asking the question of, this doesn't look like natural dyes, this looks like a synthetic dye, and wouldn't it be great if we can actually find out if between 1860 and 1870 synthetic dyes were being used in Nottingham. So we have to put that in the context of in 1856 Perkins mauve was invented, and because this is French rather than English, if the label at the front of the book is kind of accurate, there was also a scientist in France who in 1959, Verguin, invented what became known as magenta. And this colour feels more like magenta than the colour that I've seen before, which is Perkins mauve. But it would be fabulous to actually be able to identify that. And, we're hoping that will be possible with the work that Satira and Alessandra have begun. And then I wanted to show you also this sample, because it's just got a very different feel to it. Again, it goes back into that wash and that watery feel, but also the design is very different. It's a very large scale approach, and it's interesting. We've been looking in the National Archives. The National Archives don't have any of this colour applied to the lace that they have got there from the trade registers of this period. They're pretty much all white or black. So it's really interesting that the companies were registering designs as white, but then they were perhaps trying these things out in their studios and in their workshops to just see if they can add value, make things more commercial, make things more valuable. Okay, so I'm going to move over to another book now, which is from a company called Frank Woodward. And Frank Woodward, we've got 2 books from them, and we're pretty much confident with the dates of these books as being 1884 to 1893. And the reason, in terms of this project of looking at colour, that we were particularly interested in this book was because it's a slightly different approach. So it's a bit more like the images that I showed you with the Perkins mauve ? In that this feels more synthetic in its dyes and colours. That it's not the painterly style that we saw in the French novelties book, but it is, single bath dyed. So these pieces of lace would have been made in white and then dyed in separate colour baths. So you get these very flat coloured laces. And then if we go to the next example, I want to show you, and I wanted to focus particularly on these 3, where you can see the introduction of an approach where you've got 2 threads. So there's an accent thread, and that has been sort of pre-dyed before being put on the lace machine. So you've got 2 different colour threads coming into the design. Now for a long time we wondered about this purple design here, and we wondered whether that was a slightly different approach, but if you look at the top here, we've realised that basically this purple hasn't been colour fast, so it has bled across the design. So other examples to show you. So I wanted to kind of just bring your attention here where you've got something slightly different going on, where you've got different coloured threads, but actually it would have been made as a white lace and then put in a bath, and because there's different types of threads, the threads have reacted to the colour differently. So it's most obvious, I think, in this green and the yellow one where you've got these tonal qualities going on. It's much more subtle in the red. So different threads will pick up and respond to different dye types in different ways. So that's starting to be incorporated into a sort of a design approach at this period, and giving that subtle shade quality. So on this page here, this is all pre-coloured threads being used in sort of the same piece, and probably what isn't so obvious here, but if I just lift it slightly, you can see that there's a white thread, there's red, pink, blue, as well as the ecru background. So there are a number of different colours being designed into these pieces. To move quite a long way ahead in this book so we've got quite a different effect going on here, where you've got different colour threads for the background and for the patterning. So these threads are all pre-dyed and have a very different quality to them than any of the laces that we've looked at so far. And then Paper's very fragile. And if you look at these designs, which are quite similar in that the threads are being incorporated into the manufacturing process, but if you look here at this foliage, you can see that it's a variegated thread. So it's, you know, it's kind of, it's not one flat colour, and it's creating those sort of tonal qualities. So we've seen quite a lot of different approaches to colour here. And then the last one I wanted to show you in this book it's just this set that I just thought, and on this page as well, that I just think are particularly intriguing, a much heavier use of colour and a more complex design. So the colour is being used to really add to that complexity, multi-layered sort of approach. So you can see at the end of the 19th century, there's lots of things going on in terms of how designers approached colour and the kind of technical parameters that they needed to think about to enable that to happen. So we began a project with Satira and Alessandra, led by Professor Hader Lang in Science and Technology, where we wanted to sort of go through a proof of concept project where we could identify that we could take samples from lace and identify, you know, the origins of the dye stuff, the origins of the threads, and so we decided to use some less precious samples to enable us to do that proof of concept. And this is the set of samples that Alessandra and Satira did some work with. And they will talk you through their findings in more detail. I mean, if you look at this one, the reason that we chose this one is that although on one viewing it all looks as though it's the same green colour, but actually when you look a little bit harder, that is a darker green, if not a black, netted background. So, you know, we'd be intrigued to know if that was pre-dyed threads or whether that was a cross-dyed piece. We'd be really interested to sort of work that out, and they've been looking at that a little bit. So this design here, this has got two different threads in. There's a little bit of variegation in the thicker thread, and this means that the thicker thread was dyed prior to it being worked into this. Or it could be cross-dyed. We're really not sure. So that was another piece that we could sort of ask some questions about. And then I think this one again is another one where the main white thread is a synthetic thread, and that was very clear to us. But because it's very early 20th century, we were quite keen to know what that composition was, so we wanted them to look at the thread type. And I think hopefully Satira and Alessandra will tell you a little bit about that piece. So that is a very brief introduction to the archive and to the pieces that we've been looking at on this part of the colour project, in the hope that we can sort of really come up with a story about how designers used colour, how that colour was applied through the lace design process, but also start to really uncover that network of businesses that Nottingham was connecting with around the globe, sort of 200 years ago, 150 years ago, 100 years ago. And so that'll help us tell that story as well, with some real, you know, hardcore evidence of, you know, yes, this silk came from here, yes, these dyes came from here, and really kind of make what is actually invisible, you know, visible to us. Thank you.
Hello. So now I'd like to introduce my colleagues, Soteria Kogu and Alessandra Vici, who are going to share some of their analysis that they've been doing with some lace samples from the Lace Archive. Over to you guys.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So in this presentation, we will try to introduce how heritage science can assist the archival investigation of textiles, and more specifically, the investigation of Nottingham lace. To begin with, heritage science is the science that deals with the analysis of the materials and production methods of different cultural heritage objects. Given that different materials and preparation methods have been applied in different parts of the world and in different periods, the analysis and the identification of manufacturing materials and methods can offer important information about the history of an artwork, as well as information about the trading and cultural exchanges within a certain period or at a specific place a long time. In particular, the scientific analysis for the investigation of the Nottingham lace is addressed in two directions. The first one involves the material identification, that involves the identification of threads, dyeing and finishing materials. And the other direction focuses on the examination of the various manufacturing methods.
So for the identification of the material, we know that threads have been composed or are composed of natural, semi-synthetic or synthetic materials. So natural since ancient times, and for semi-synthetic and synthetic, we are talking about since the middle 19th century. It is very good because to know that this, especially in the beginning, there were patents, so we know exactly when certain fibers were available for manufacturing purposes. And this is very important to look, for example, understand if the material of a lace is made of a synthetic fibers, so we know where to locate it in time. At the same time, we need to analyze the dye, which again, natural and synthetic dyes. The natural one used since very ancient times were plant-based or animal-based, and then since again the mid-19th century, there's been the huge amount of synthetic dyes that have been introduced, and we are talking about hundreds of dye types since azo dyes were first synthesized. So it is also a challenge from a scientific point of view to discriminate this kind of dyes. And then in the end, we have the finishing product, again, natural or synthetic. And these are very important for laces because they've been used to give a specific texture and finishing appearances. So again, it's important, and this is something that we've been focusing on.
As mentioned before, one of the aims of the scientific analysis is the examination of the different manufacturing methods. As Amanda mentioned in her talk, the Nottingham lace has a long history with many variations through time in the different manufacturing techniques. So, in order to address these two aims, the material identification and the examination of the different manufacturing techniques, the Nottingham Lace Archive came in contact with our group, ISA group, that offer scientific analysis in a non-invasive way. That means that there is no requirement to extract fibers from the lace in order to do either the material identification or the manufacturing techniques examination. In the next slides, we will present you a few results from our preliminary analysis on different samples, lace samples.
So for the understanding of the composition of the lace threads, so we based our analysis on the possibility of discriminating on molecular composition. So we are looking at the laces target materials, so molecules, and then we can map them to understand which lace is composed, thread is composed of what. So here I'm going to show two examples, and you can see already that these two laces have two different threads at least. We can discriminate it by color, but are they the same material? So what we were able to do is with a technique called FTIR microscopy, we were able to detect the signal which coming from cellulose for the example one, which made us understand that the whiter thread and the cream colored one is most probably cotton or viscose, whereas the green one, which is on top, it's actually made of silk, because we were able to map the presence of protein component. It was interesting in the example, in the second example, that yes, one thread again was most probably cotton or viscose, rayon. However, the other threads that looked a bit more shiny, it wasn't silk, but the signature, the chemical signature was that of polyamide, so commonly known as nylon, which means that the lace too cannot be dated earlier than the 1930s. Then I'm going to show you two case studies we have been analyzing that are from the Nottingham Lace Archive. This first example is catalogued early, about the 1850. And so our goal was to try to collect data which could confirm this date. So again, we're looking under the microscope. Both the net and the embroideries looked very similar in color and also in appearance. And then this was confirmed when we tried to map what the component was of the threads, and this was again a proteinaceous component. And because of the specific signature, we could identify this as silk, which is encouraging because it's matching the date of the catalog. We were also able to detect other components which could indicate, for example, manufacturing or finishing products, but they can also be impurities. However, because they were widespread, in this case was gypsum, it could also be an indication of a product used during the manufacturing as well. In this last example, we were asked to analyze these three levers lace, which have the variegated colors, and the question was, are the same threads and are the dyes the same, for example, for these three different examples. These were dated around the 20th century. So what was very interesting to find, again, under the microscope, was that yes, there are different threads, and these are actually, although could be similar in their, let's say, chemical composition, because they are both cellulose-based. However, we identified the main thread, in this case for this pink part, as possibly cotton, whereas the part from the other embroideries, in this case for the purple one, it's most probably viscose, which means it's a semi-synthetic lace as a thread. This pattern was found for all three laces, and in terms of the dye analysis, we have tried to do some measurement, and this gave us an information about the possibility of the pink part of this particular lace to be a natural anthraquinone and non-synthetic. So again, this information can help us into dating and understanding the manufacturing processes of the laces.
About the examination of the different manufacturing methods, what we starting our new project is about the 3D scanning of the different lace samples in high resolution. So we are using our high resolution imaging systems that offer us, as you can see here, the imaging in very high resolution of the individual threads, but also give us information about the knitting methods that have been followed in the different lace samples. And here we show you some preliminary results of the high resolution 3D scanning of 3 different lace samples. And you can see that we can see in a very high resolution the different knitting methods that have been followed. To conclude, what we saw in these pilot studies is that scientific analysis can give us very important information about the material composition and the manufacturing method of the different pieces of lace that belong to the Nottingham Lace Archives. And this information can be very important for the dating of the different lace samples. In our future plans are to analyze a broad range of samples of the Nottingham Lace Archives in order to create a Nottingham Lace database that will include both the material characterization but also information about the manufacturing procedure. And something else is that we are aiming to have a cross-correlation between the Nottingham Lace samples with textile samples from other collections like the National Archives collection, in order aiming to get information about the trading and cultural exchanges in different periods with ultimate target to get information that will assist us to investigate the textile globalization. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Satira and Alessandra. That's it's fascinating stuff. But I'm going to move on and introduce our next speaker, and that is Dr. Ruth Mather. Unfortunately, Stephen King couldn't join us today. So Ruth is going to kind of reflect on the early stages of her research project, which aims to ask questions about the journey from raw materials to finished lace products and the pivotal role that lace has played in global and complex networks of trade. Over to you, Ruth.
Okay, so hopefully you can see. I'll just put this into slideshow. Okay, so yeah, thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Satira and Alessandra as well for a really interesting presentation. So this is a new project called Lace End to End that myself, Professor Steve King, and Dr. Andy Gritt here at NTU started around May this year, so it's still quite new. But what I'm hoping to share today is some of our kind of initial findings and some of the directions that we want to go in future as well. So what we're aiming to do is to write a kind of biography of Nottingham Lace as it take into account the kind of global perspectives of it. So the ways in which the industry was embedded in networks of global supply and demand, and the exchange of ideas, influences and technologies, as well as finished goods. And what we would like to do is to follow the journey of Nottingham Lace from raw materials through manufacturing and marketing to use, reuse, and then eventual disposal. And we're particularly interested in what Nottingham Lace and these stages of its life cycle can tell us about power and identity. So things like who benefited and who lost out from the mechanisation and mass production of lace. How was lace used to express different identities, and how did it tie into things like power relationships based on class, race and gender? I just wanted to show this image, which is of a woman making lace curtains, but handmade lace tended to be made by women, while the early lace machines were predominantly worked by men, and women tended to be involved in kind of finishing processes like removing excess threads and things like that. So this image actually shows the shift during the First World War, when women were called upon to take up jobs that had previously been held by men. So it's actually quite an unusual kind of gender balance there. The other thing that we're really interested in is what lace use and reuse has meant to people through time. So why lace is attached to rituals like weddings, christenings, and how lace items kind of get reused as well. So particularly things like a lot of people repurpose their wedding dress as a christening gown for their first child, things like that. And kind of why lace is tied into that sort of ritual. and also kind of thinking about the sort of mythologies and traditions that grow up around lace and whether those still apply to kind of mass-produced mechanized lace. I just wanted to show this lovely advert from a women's magazine from 1950. And so this is kind of advertising their lace by showing, it might be quite difficult to see just on the screen, but each little box around it is a kind of strange fact about lace. I'm not sure entirely how factual they all are, but it kind of gives details of things like how much lace different royals owned, kind of various kind of possibly quite dubious things about its production, and then kind of just strange little anecdotes like that lace bed sheets tickled people in the 17th century. So yeah, it's kind of this sort of sense of continuity and tradition, even with kind of 1950s machine-made lace, that is kind of tying back into an older tradition. So I want to talk a little bit now about some of what we've already found in terms of the kind of start of the story, which is the raw materials. And I'll be focusing here as well on the 19th century, so the kind of heyday of Nottingham lace. And as you will have seen in the previous presentation, Nottingham lace was made of various different materials, sometimes more than one material in any kind of given piece of lace. But my focus here is on cotton. That's partly because it was in Nottingham that the use of cotton for lace making was popularised. A man called Thomas Cartledge in 1805 produced a kind of cotton yarn that was particularly good for lace making. It was doubled in such a way that it was much stronger than linen, which had previously been kind of popularly used, particularly for handmade lace. And so this kind of cotton was much stronger, so you could basically make more without things breaking. It basically made the process more efficient for both handmade and machine-made lace. So it kind of made it much easier to use cotton in the machine lace industry. And historians of the cotton industry have pointed to the role of demand as well as supply in fueling the really rapid growth of the cotton industry that was seen in the 19th century. And this growth of lace making also kind of contributed to that boom. That was something that was recorded by this guy, who's William Falcon. I think Amanda's already mentioned him today, but he was a lace manufacturer. He was a mayor of Nottingham for a while, and he also wrote a history of the machine lace and hosiery trades in Nottingham, which is a really useful source of information on the development of the industry, and kind of also how it kind of affected social life more generally. So what Falcon noted was that cotton yarn spinning developed around Nottingham, but was also the yarn was also sourced from Durham and from kind of the Manchester area as well. Now, obviously, this is another kind of global connection too, because cotton doesn't grow in the UK. So this cotton that's kind of being spun in those areas is coming from much further afield. So the main suppliers of cotton to the UK were the West Indies and Brazil in the late 18th century, and then into the 19th century, the United States superseded both and became the main supplier, kind of via Liverpool. And the reason that the US was able to provide kind of abundant and cheap supplies of raw cotton was because of the exploitation of enslaved people on the plantations of the US South. So even after Britain had abolished slavery within its own colonies, the economy was still really heavily reliant on the institution of chattel slavery. So basically owning people as property and forcing them to work for free. And that was to provide materials for this kind of really key industry. So kind of it's crucial to the development of the Industrial Revolution. And in this image, you can see that, you know, there's men, women and children all working to pick the cotton, but it's also a very kind of sanitized image. It gives kind of, you know, a landscape. It's a kind of an idealized version that kind of masks the intensity of the labor and the cruelty of the punishments that were meted out to people, and also just kind of the horror of an industry that revolved around kind of buying and selling people. So one of the things that we've been interested to know more about is what the attitudes of people in Nottingham, and particularly people within the lace institution of chattel slavery. And our research using 19th century newspapers shows that there was actually quite an awareness of the links between cotton and lace and slavery, quite a strong anti-slavery sentiment. So to bring us back to William Falcon, in 1849 he attended mayoral dinner, at which there were also some American agents looking to kind of facilitate trade with the Nottingham lace industry in America. And instead of giving a toast, Falcon stood up and gave a speech, which I'll just quote a little bit from. But he said that it was a serious and solemn duty that when gentlemen appeared amongst us, exercising not merely an influence in purchasing goods from the warehouses of Nottingham, but also exercising an influence on the other side of the Atlantic, it was a duty to let them understand that no motives of self-interest would ever shut the mouth of a true-born Briton on the subject of slavery. And this was apparently met with cheers, and also the Americans kind of agreed with him as well, and sort of said that, you know, they thought it was that they supported abolition as well. But I'm not entirely sure how he kind of reconciled this sort of strength of feeling with the use of cotton within the lace industry. It's an ambivalence that we see quite a lot within the cotton and lace industries. So Suzanne Seymour at Nottingham's done some research on the Struts, who were kind of big cotton manufacturers in Derbyshire, and who also supplied a number of Nottingham lace manufacturers. And they, despite their abolitionist principles, also kind of continued to rely on the supply of goods produced by enslaved people. So there is this there. And I think, you know, we can't, they didn't know what was going on. This connection was clearly recognised at the time. And around the same time that Falcon made that speech, there was quite a prominent campaign in the local press against free trade that linked cotton, lace and slavery. So the campaigners against free trade wanted more protection for agriculture. And what they felt was that the British government was unduly influenced by the cotton manufacturing interest in Manchester. So they referred to the so-called cotton lords as being the most inhuman of slave drivers. And they argued that what the purpose of kind of promoting free trade among these cotton manufacturers was to get the cheapest possible labour, both on the plantations of the US and in their own factories. So as part of this campaign, they suggested that a national wool league should be formed, and that would promote the use of wool rather than cotton, and they included lace manufacturing the industries that should do that. It was a campaign that was supported by the Nottinghamshire Guardian, the local paper, who suggested that the lace manufacturers should look to France for inspiration. So they noted that wool lace was being brought over from Paris, and it was selling at over 4 francs per yard. So they were advising that the lace manufacturers should go and visit the factories in France and get some inspiration about kind of designs and how to use lace to replace the reliance on cotton. And the next week they kind of returned to the same theme again, but they kind of used much more kind of heroic terms as well in this one, which I'll just quote. So they said, "Let the manufacturers rouse their energies and their fortune is made, and they have the honour and glory of aiding in the patriotic emancipation of their country from its present degrading thraldom to the United States, and in the philanthropic and righteous deed of putting down slavery." So the anti-slavery sentiment that was there was also kind of mixed up in economic interest and a sort of national pride and national identity of Britain wanting to be seen as a place that that was against slavery, that had abolished slavery. So there's still these kind of strange mix of motivations there. The campaign obviously wasn't hugely successful, so cotton did continue to be used throughout the 19th century. One thing that we're really interested in finding out a bit more about going forward is the attitude of the workers themselves as well, and kind of what they thought about working with cotton lace, what their opinions were on the links of the trade to slavery. And we do know that they were kind of attending lectures on sort of the horrors of slavery institute. So again, there's kind of some awareness of precisely what they kind of thought about it yet. And another thing we're interested in is the kind of return of lace across the Atlantic and how it was used on cotton plantations themselves. So how might enslaved people have encountered lace, either in the possessions of the slaveholders or in things that they might have owned themselves, and what did that mean to them? And I'll come to that a little bit. But I want to move on now to thinking about lace. I've kind of suggested that we can think about power and identity in terms of the way that lace was produced, but these are also evident in consumer behaviour too. So I'm going to kind of move on a bit to how kind of finished lace was used. At the start of the 19th century, in 1806, machine lace was still a kind of relative novelty, and the Morning Post's fashion column condemned it as odious stuff. So they were a little bit snobbish about it. They said it was fit only for servant girls and young lady milliners. So that's kind of emphasising the feminisation of lace, as well as some kind of class dimensions of machine-made lace. I think this image kind of shows some of what's kind of what emerges from that column for me. So this is obviously of a woman hand making lace, and her customers who are obviously much kind of wealthier than she is. You can see that the customers are women, and the lace maker is a woman as well. But it kind of shows that kind of class dimension of the lace wearer versus the lace maker. And what machine made lace seems to be doing in that article is kind of disrupting that kind of class basis. And that is something that is kind of made explicit further down in the same article, where they talk about machine-made lace as an imitation, which they argued imitations of luxury tend to destroy the subordination of the lower ranks of society. So there's clearly this kind of anxiety there about people getting above their station. It raises interesting questions for me about whether lace could be used in a kind of everyday resistance. So perhaps building on scholarship that suggests that enslaved women adapted and embellished their clothes as a kind of means of resisting the dehumanization of the institution of slavery, kind of asserting their own individuality and their own desires through the ways that they could, kind of get their hands on things to adapt their clothes. Whether that's kind of a more widespread practice, whether that might have involved lace. So that's something we're kind of looking into going forward. And also thinking about Nottingham lace as a mark of respectability as well. So as things like lace curtains became more accessible, lower down the social scale, they could be used to kind of signal a connection to kind of respectable domesticity. And that's something we see in the US. They had a phrase of the lace curtain Irish, which was the kind of more upwardly mobile migrants kind of using their domestic interior to sort of signal their respectability. And it's something we see here as well for the kind of later 20th century in Michael Macmillan's West Indian front room, which he curated for the Museum of the Home. And you can see there's lots of kind of lace and crochet items, but Michael Macmillan talks about it as a kind of echo of the respectable Victorian parlour that was kind of being used as a means of kind of projecting respectability and having, a nice space to show off, even as what kind of West Indian people were facing a lot of discrimination in society as well. So I think it also kind of raises the issue of the way that the meanings of lace can change over time too. So in 1851, the Princess Royal attended the Great Exhibition wearing Nottingham lace in her clothing, and so by that point it's clearly not just something for servant girls, and I think that signals a kind of shifting context where Nottingham lace is being worn as a symbol of British industrial success. And to me that also kind of had echoes in the kind of media reception for Kate Middleton's wedding gown, which involved some Cluny lace. And then the kind of media were talking about it as a kind of heritage industry, and again as a sort of symbol of national identity. So I think there's all these kind of really interesting meanings kind of tied up in the way that people use and reuse lace. Which brings me to a bit of a kind of call for audience participation. So we're kind of very conscious that a lot of the meanings of lace are quite personal, and they emerge through the ways that it's used and reused within families and within households, and through kind of important rituals as well, as I mentioned earlier, things like christenings and marriages. So what we're hoping to do later this year is run some oral history sessions where we'd like to recruit participants to talk to us about the way that they've kind of used lace, reused and recycled it. So perhaps, you know, using lace curtains to make a dress, things like that, so that we can really get people's own kind of memories and knowledge involved in the project as well, and really get a sense of those personal meanings of lace. So our email addresses are there. So yeah, do please get in touch if you'd like to be involved in that. The call will go out probably in the autumn, but obviously if you'd like to get in touch before that, we'd love to hear from you. But yeah, with that, I'm going to hand back over to Amanda. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you. That was really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah,
Great.
no, that all came over really well.
Yep.
So please do type any questions that you might have in the chat, because I think we've got a few minutes. We've managed to keep within the hour slot that we were given, but we've perhaps got a few minutes for any questions that come in. There are some questions already here, so I will respond to these, because these two are about the archive. So the first question is, did Nottingham differ to other lace? Was there a recognisable knot style? No, I mean, I think, you know, sort of Ruth sort of put some of this quite nicely, actually, in that Nottingham lace was really about emulating handmade styles. It was about taking, you know, that very unaffordable fabric that was all created by hand, and making it on a machine, and democratizing it, really, meaning that it was available for the masses. Rather than the classes, is kind of a saying in Nottingham lace. And does the NTU lace archive differ to other lace archives globally? Are there any unique items? Yeah, I mean, I think what we have is actually incredibly unique, and I think what we have is unique because we're not a museum. It was essentially a teaching collection, so nobody has gone out into the world as collections people do who work in museums and said, we're going to collect these examples and make sure that we cover every style of lace. What we've got is really as a result of donations from the lace industry. So we've got a real kind of time capsule of you know, the Victorian heyday of the sort of amazing lace manufacture that was coming out of this city from probably around 1880 to 1940, but we don't even really know that. We don't really know. We don't have any records of when it started and when it ended being collected, but we do have pieces of lace that are older than that, because all of the business in Nottingham were buying handmade lace samples so that they could work, that they were kind of influencing how they might develop new pieces of lace technically. So there are lots of pieces of much older lace. Sort of unique items. The oldest item we've got is a 16th century. It's part of a priest chasuble, and it's hand embroidered lace, and it's quite an incredible piece. It looks like carved ivory, really. It's so dense and depth. I'd love to get Satira's technology looking at that lace. That'd be really fascinating piece to look at. And I think there was Ruth made reference to somebody turning up at 1851, the Princess Royal in machine made lace. We've got some lace samples from those of us who are old enough will know her as the Queen Mother, but we've got some samples from Queen Elizabeth, our current Queen's mother, from her wedding dress, and I think that was 1921. So so yes, there was pieces of lace made for her in Nottingham. And I feel compelled to just point out that Kate's Princess Catherine's dress had lace from the lace that was most visible here. It was from Calais. It was from France. It wasn't actually from Calais. And yes, she did have the bridesmaid and her train had Cluny lace on as well. So there was two different sort of heritage lace making going on in that garment. So are there any other questions? Do any of the panel want to make any comments or anything that you didn't say earlier? I would just say, Ruth, I've just been reading something today from an interview with somebody who works at Cluny Lace, and the interview was in 2016, and she'd previously worked for Birkins, and she wanted to be a twist hand. And she tried, I'm imagining, I haven't quite got the dates in front of me, but I'm imagining this is kind of the 80s and 90s, that she wanted to be a twist hand at Birkins and they wouldn't have a woman being a twist hand. But actually Cluny, she said, had trained women to be twist hands. So yeah, so that gender divide, you know, was still relatively recent in terms of the jobs that men and women did in lace factories.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I'll send you the reference for that paper.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, because there's obviously like distinctions between the different companies as well and different ways of working. So yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, so if we have no questions, no further questions, I will draw this to a conclusion. And okay, thanks, Josh. So thank you so much to Ruth and Satira and Alessandra for giving their time this evening to share the work that we're doing with lace, and we hope to share these stories with you in the future in perhaps different ways. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.